Excuse me. Was there some connection between what the distinction you were just making and the declarative and non-declarative memory that one of the pieces talks about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll discuss that in some detail. I think there is. So you have these three separate memory systems. One of them is non-declarative, which basically, it's non-representational. That's the procedural system. Procedural memory governs your motor output if it's habitual, fundamentally. That's right. You use your procedural memory to walk with, because walking is way too complicated to do as a consequence of representation. It's such a complex, well, you can't think about how to walk. It's a habit, it's a skill. It's like if you play the piano. If you know a piece off by heart, as soon as you think about it, well, your fingers stumble over themselves because it's too complicated to think about. You can't handle all that information in your active conscience. Anyways, we've coded a lot of behavioral information in our procedural systems. It's not declarative, it's not representational. It's there. Well, I think part of what a story is it is the representation of the patterns of behavior that are coded in the procedural systems. So you see, like when we're engaged in any sort of interaction, you and I are both modifying the contents of our procedural memory systems by exchanging, to put it very harshly, by exchanging reinforcements. We do not understand the nature of the pattern that's the outcome of that exchange. But we can watch it. And that's what a story is. It's I think that's our episodic memory system that picks up images, basically. Because, well, we'll get into that. Your right hemisphere is good at recognizing patterns, and your behaviors have patterns. Obviously, that's why you can predict behaviors. They have patterns. One of the ways that we make those patterns explicit is by making images of them and then describing the images. And that's basically what a story does. You read a kid a story. Basically, what you're doing is you're using words to activate images of behaviors. And you're trying to instill behavioral patterns by doing that. Anyways, you don't understand the story, and that's obvious. There's lots of stories we tell our kids that we have the foggiest notion of what they mean. So, fairy tales are like that. They're very peculiar stories. But the kids are interested in them, and they'll listen to them over and over and over and over and over. And that's because there's a lot of information in those stories, like more than you can possibly imagine, all embedded in those stories. And the person who's listening to it doesn't understand it, and the person who's telling it doesn't understand it, but the information is still transmitted. So, which is very peculiar. It's very strange. So I started thinking about that because I was when I started understanding that religious systems of thought actually had some meaning, that the stories they were telling were accurate, then I couldn't figure out, well, if they're accurate, how the hell did they develop if no one understands what they mean? Which is impossible, right? It's like, how do you develop a system of thought in the absence of any understanding of what the system means? Well, that seems like a completely insoluble problem. It's like, well, Jung pointed out something similar with dreams. He said a dream will sometimes give you a premonition of a future state. And he didn't mean that you could interpret the future by reading your dreams. He meant that the thing that you will become is, in a sense, operative now in its nascent form. And well, that nascent form has more to do with dream structure and imagination than it does with anything explicit. If you can interpret your dreams, sometimes you can see where it is that you're headed. And again, it was the same mystery. How is it that your brain can know where you're going to be when you can't even understand what that means? But that's why this multiple memory system theory is really useful, because you can say, well, look at social animals, for example. Like a wolf obviously does not have a declarative representation of the nature of its social structure. It knows who's what on the dominance hierarchy, and it knows how to behave, but it can't describe its patterns of behavior. They're not conscious, meaning they're not representational, they're not declarative. But they're still there, and they're there because they've been selected for from the Darwinian perspective. It's like these patterns of interaction. There's certain patterns of social interaction that are stable over time. They emerge as a consequence of social interactions. And they emerge way before the groups that have the patterns understand what the patterns are. And our attempts to spin stories, our descriptions of those patterns of action before we understand what they are.